everyone. Myself, Laura, Charity, Amelia, and Jessica are going to be presenting on the language sample today and how the language sample pertains to English learners. So prior to beginning this project, our group knew a little bit about language samples. We knew that language samples are typically used to supplement standardized assessments. We know that language samples provide a more naturalistic and informal approach to assessment. We know there are many ways to analyze language samples, as well as there are many ways to elicit language samples from clients. We know that language samples are good across populations and disorders, and we were familiar with things like MLU, type-to-open ratio, and T units.
So while we had some basic background information about how to do language sampling for English speakers, we really wanted to examine how can we use language samples for English learner populations. So what are the differences in procedure? We know something about analysis and elicitation techniques, but are there specific analysis or elicitation techniques that are better for English learners? And we wanted to know, are these culturally biased? We're aware that many standardized tests are culturally biased, but does that extend to language sampling, which is not standardized, but could potentially have some biases? And how can we reduce those? And then finally, we wanted to know what types of professionals we might be working with while doing language sampling with English learners.
So by completing this project, we learned a lot of different things about language sampling. As we go through our presentation, you'll get to see what we did learn. Just to give you a brief synopsis, we learned about elicitation techniques that are especially useful in English learners. We learned about SALT software. We learned about different types of analyses that can be used. We also learned about the types of books that can be used in elicitation techniques. And overall, we did learn that language samples are less biased than standardized assessments.
Okay, so this is our advanced organizer for what we're going to present today. First off, what is the purpose of language sampling for English learners, and how do you elicit a language sample for English learners?
Then we're going to ask, how do you analyze a language sample for English learners, and what is SALT software, and how can we use it with English learners?
And finally, we're going to look at some special considerations for language sampling with English learners, because there are some things we need to keep in mind when we're doing this with different types of populations. And we'll be looking at our references.
Okay, so a language sample can be used to analyze many things about an individual's language abilities. However, we mainly assess the lexical diversity, grammar, sentence length, and sentence complexity. It can be used with every client and actually provides a naturalistic assessment compared to the standardized assessment. With English learners, it provides us a chance to closely examine the influences of culture as well as the second language.
So how do we elicit a language sample? First, it's important to note that you need to test in the child's native language. Depending on your ability as a clinician, you may need to hire a translator. We'll go into the details of this a little bit later. The research has shown that wordless picture books are excellent for eliciting language samples. Across the literature, we've seen the Mercer-Mayer picture books pop up time and time again with great results. There are two types of language samples or means of eliciting a language sample from a pictorial stimulus. There is the tell and the retell. For the story tell, there is a high inter-rater reliability, a common contextual reference point between the student and the clinician, a greater sense of control for the clinician over story complexity, and this is number of characters, types of plots, and different variabilities that the child could throw into the mix. And also, it lowers the cognitive demand on the child because they don't have to think of a story from memory. The other type is the story retell. This is great because it provides a model for a child. In some cultures, narrative is not expected as a skill for the child. or children in general. So providing a model for the child can help them produce longer responses and make them feel more comfortable. Because of this, there's often a higher accuracy in identifying different traits for diagnosis or screening. Other techniques are play-based activities, language samples that have been recorded in the home, and open-ended questioning.
So how do we analyze the language sample? The literature differs on how many utterances that you need to take, but usually it's about 25 to 50, and you'll use these in your analysis. It's important that you analyze both languages just as you took both languages. There's lots of different tools that we're aware of, MLU, type token ratio to look at lexical diversity and morphosyntactics. But a really interesting tool that we came across during our research was the assessment of fictional narratives. It's sort of like a checklist where you can look at microstructure and macrostructure of the narrative along with intelligibility, which is a wonderful advantage of the language sample because you're able to look at the child's phonetic inventory as well. And the one great thing about modern technology is that we now have software to analyze the sample for us. So we'll talk a little bit about the software, but there also are free options available for us. For example, the computerized language analysis software. So Plan is free so that you don't have to pay a lot of money to have help with your analysis.
As Jessica mentioned, there is some software called SALT software. That stands for Systematic Analysis of Language Transcripts. And there's a free portion, which includes audio elicitations and transcripts, but only in Spanish and English. But for purchase, you can get some software that allows you to compare the results of thousands of different language samples for children in English and in Spanish for different types of language analysis. It also helps you create a performance report, which is really fantastic because it saves us as clinicians time. It also has a very specific protocol for how we would elicit these samples, which helps to sort of standardize the process. So while it's still not standardized, it does help to standardize it more, which allows us to get a better criterion reference. According to the SALT software brochure, so they're advertising to us, but they say that it provides data for goals and measurements and that we can use this as clinicians to see if students are progressing. And it's also quicker and easier with less training necessary, which is great because we all know language sampling can be difficult and time-consuming without a lot of experience. And so this helps us to complete the process more efficiently.
Considerations for English learners when collecting a language sample. So first of all, the speech-language pathologist must be aware of normal development in the child's primary and secondary languages. If we don't know what's normal, how can we classify what isn't? Additionally, the speech-language pathologist must be aware of language acquisition stages in both language and where that child falls within those stages. If the speech-language pathologist is not proficient in a language that is being sampled, then you have to bring in a translator. So when we hire a translator, there are typically 3 stages that we go through with them. The first stage is briefing the translator before the session. We brief the translator to ensure that the correct instructions and prompting are provided in the session so we have an accurate collection of data. The interaction is the session itself. So one thing that we can do during the interaction and with the translator is to have the translator ask the child to tell a story from their own specific culture. At the end of the session, we go into the debriefing stage with the translator. And at this time, we will discuss the outcomes of the session and make any necessary follow-up plans. In this time, it is also a good idea to ask the translator if, due to cultural differences, if there was anything that you, as a speech-language pathologist, didn't pick up on. This could be figurative language, and so on and so forth. So we must always consider culture. we need to ask ourselves, does the English learner's culture influence the language sample? We must always be culturally responsive and competent. We need to employ critical thinking, do our research, and analyze any type of diagnostic assessment or screening assessment with these considerations in mind. All right, so these are the references that we used to provide you with all of this information. We hope that you learned as much as we did about language sampling from this assignment.